Welcome. Today we are going to sleep inspired by the life story of one of the greatest legend of medieval history, Napoleon Bonaparte. Let us keep our lens of right and wrong aside and appreciate the achievements of great legends and learn from their life as we drift into sleep. Believe me, these history of legendary persons will add immense value to your life. Please concentrate on story and try to connect with situations and feel yourself in those shoes, and that will transform you. The life of Napoleon Bonaparte is a sweeping tale of ambition, brilliance, contradiction, and relentless transformation. One that reshaped not only France, but the entire European continent and beyond. Born in Corsica in 1769, a land recently annexed by France, Napoleon's formative years were marked by cultural tensions that deeply influenced his identity and values. As a child, he was a fiercely proud Corsican, intensely aware of his island's struggle for independence and often at odds with the French establishment. Despite linguistic and social barriers, his thick Corsican accent and modest background initially setting him apart and subjecting him to ridicule. Napoleon's prodigious intellect, discipline, and determination propelled him into the elite French military academies. These early experiences forged the character of a man who was both an outsider and a relentless self-creator. The drive to prove himself, fueled by feelings of alienation and the burden of his family's compromised political loyalties, shaped a vision of power and control that would come to dominate his life. His mother's stern discipline and the influence of revolutionary ideals seeded a complex mix of ambition, strategic calculation, and a conviction that he was destined to lead and remake the world. Napoleon's meteoric rise was catalyzed by the upheavals of the French Revolution, which destroyed the old aristocratic hierarchy and opened the doors for talent and merit to ascend rapidly. His military genius first surfaced conspicuously during the Siege of Toulon, where his daring and tactical acuity launched him into prominence. He swiftly mastered the art of artillery and battlefield command, combining strict discipline with charismatic leadership that inspired fierce loyalty among his troops. His breakthrough victories in Italy and Egypt further cemented his reputation as one of history's preeminent commanders. Yet, Napoleon was more than a military tactician. He was a visionary statesman who reshaped legal and administrative structures, creating lasting reforms such as the Napoleonic Code, which introduced ideas of equality before the law, property rights, and secular authority that underpin modern legal systems across much of the world. He centralized the French state, reformed education with the establishment of, and negotiated the Concordat to reconcile with the Catholic Church while safeguarding secular freedoms. Despite these achievements, his reign was riddled with contradictions and profound challenges. His relentless military campaigns across Europe brought both glory and devastation, embroiling the continent in wars that caused immense human suffering. His autocratic governance concentrated power often through suppression, curtailing free speech, reinstating hereditary titles, and at times reversing gains in civil rights. His policies on slavery, race, and women's rights reflect the complex and often troubling realities of his era and personality. Napoleon cultivated an image of charismatic authority, carefully shaping his legend through mastery of propaganda, symbolism, and public spectacle. His self-coronation as emperor underscored his ambition to link himself to historical grandeur, presenting himself as both a product of revolutionary ideals and a new sovereign. His personal life, including his tempestuous relationship with Josephine and later marriage to Marie-Louise, added dimensions of passion, loyalty, and political alliance to his story, humanizing a figure often mythologized for his larger-than-life persona. Beyond his political and military saga lie lesser-known aspects that invite curiosity and deepen his complexity. Napoleon struggled with insecurities, manifesting as an intense work ethic and occasional paranoia. He had quirks, reputedly tone-deaf and possibly superstitious, and habits like walking incognito among his subjects, reflecting a keen psychological awareness. His interest in science and the arts, patronage of scholars, and fascination with codes and history reveal a polymathic mind restless for knowledge. the mysterious circumstances of his final exile and death on St. Helena, including enduring conspiracy theories about poisoning, continue to intrigue historians and enthusiasts alike. What makes Napoleon's story eternally inspiring is less the simplistic triumphs or failures than the profound arc of a man who rose relentlessly from margins to mastery, reshaping not only states but the very ideas of law, governance, and identity. His life encapsulates the tension between revolutionary change and authoritarian control, individual destiny and historical forces, military might and legal innovation. His legacy compels us to reflect on the costs and possibilities of power, the realities of ambition, and the enduring human quest to forge order from chaos. Through his military strategies still studied today, his legal codes that shaped modern justice, and the mythic imprint he left on collective memory, Napoleon Bonaparte remains one of history's most compelling legends, an emblem of talent and contradiction, of creation and destruction. The journey from a bullied Corsican boy to Emperor of the French, his trials and triumphs, and the complexities of his character provide a vast landscape of human experience, offering lessons and mysteries that continue to engage, challenge, and inspire. Born on August 15, 1769, on the rugged island of Corsica, Napoleon Bonaparte entered a world of political turmoil and cultural contrast. Corsica, having been acquired by France from the Republic of Genoa only months before his birth, was a place caught between identities. French laws, language, and customs were imposed on a proud, fiercely independent Corsican people who cherished their heritage. Napoleon grew up speaking Italian and a Corsican dialect, speaking little French until his education took him to the mainland. This duality of belonging neither fully to France nor purely to Corsica marked his early life, shaping a restless ambition to prove himself in a world where he was at first an outsider. Napoleon's family, though noble, was not wealthy or influential in the traditional French aristocratic sense. His father, Carlo Bonaparte, was a lawyer and nationalist Corsican who initially supported Corsican independence under Pasquale Paoli before switching allegiance to France. This political complexity echoed in Napoleon's upbringing, providing him with lessons in both loyalty and pragmatic adaptation. His mother, Laetitia Romolino, was a strong-willed and pragmatic woman who instilled in her children's discipline, resilience, and a fierce sense of family pride. She prepared young Napoleon for a harsh world with a mixture of sternness and unwavering support. At the age of 9, Napoleon was sent to mainland France to attend military schools, where he confronted the challenges of cultural displacement and class prejudice. At the Brienne-le-Château Military Academy, and later the École Militaire in Paris, his Corsican accent and modest origins made him a target of ridicule among the French elite. These early experiences left deep marks, fueling his determination to rise above limitations and stereotypes. He was gruff, serious, and intensely focused, traits that distinguished him from his peers and hinted at the iron will he would later wield across Europe. Napoleon excelled academically, particularly in mathematics, military strategy, and history. His education was rigorous and classical, steeped in the Enlightenment ideals that were turning Europe upside down: the equality of men, meritocracy, and the potential of reason to remake society. Though he was only partly fluent in French, his voracious reading and ability to absorb complex military concepts set him apart. His early fascination with figures like Julius Caesar and Alexander the Great reveals a mind drawn irresistibly toward power, conquest, and leadership. The storm of the French Revolution broke when Napoleon was a young artillery officer stationed in mainland France. The revolution's radical upheaval shattered the old society dominated by aristocrats and monarchy and created unprecedented opportunities for talented individuals to advance on merit rather than birth. Napoleon embraced the revolutionary cause, seeing in it the chance to transcend his origins and bend fate to his will. His patriotism was complex, bound by both a love for Corsica and a commitment to the revolutionary ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity. His first major military achievements came during the Siege of Toulon in 1793, where his brilliance in artillery deployment helped recapture a key port from royalist forces backed by the British. At just 24 years old, his tactical genius earned him promotion to brigadier general, thrusting him into the spotlight and setting him on a path toward commanding armies and shaping nations. But this meteoric rise was built not only on skill, but also on political savvy, personal ambition, and an ability to inspire loyalty among soldiers. The early successes in Italy, where he led the French army to victories against larger Austrian forces, proved his capacity to combine innovation with ruthless efficiency. Using speed, surprise, and bold maneuvers, Napoleon outflanked enemies and won battles that seemed impossible. These campaigns were not just about military conquest. They spread revolutionary ideals, dismantled old regimes, and gave him a taste of power that would soon become intoxicating. Yet, even in these early years, challenges abounded. Political intrigue within the revolutionary government, shifting alliances, and the volatile public opinion required him to navigate treacherous waters as carefully as the battlefields. His bluntness, occasional arrogance, and willingness to sideline rivals made enemies as well as admirers. But formidable obstacles only hardened his resolve. This first stage of Napoleon's life lays bare the foundations of a man who would become legend, the outsider driven by desire for acceptance and dominance, the visionary who saw himself as the agent of history's sweep, the commander whose ruthlessness was entwined with charisma, and the reformer who believed that law, education, and order could rebuild society from chaos. As the revolution matured and France grappled with internal dissent and external threats, Napoleon's star was destined to rise higher still, carrying with it hopes, contradictions, and battles that would redraw the map of Europe. After the Siege of Toulon had catapulted Napoleon into prominence, his military career began to accelerate at a dizzying pace. The victory had demonstrated something rare in a young officer. Not only technical mastery of artillery and an instinct for exploiting opportunities, but also the ability to coordinate multiple arms of the military into a coherent, decisive blow. These qualities were noticed by the French revolutionary leadership, which at the time was desperate for competent commanders to defend the fragile republic from both internal royalist revolts and the encircling armies of Europe's monarchies. In the volatile atmosphere of 1794 and 1795, France was in constant flux. The revolution had entered a more moderate phase after the fall of Robespierre, but the country remained deeply unstable. Politically, economically, and militarily. Famine, inflation, and war strained the social fabric, while ambitious men of talent used the openings to climb the ladder of power. Napoleon, still in his mid-20s, was exactly the kind of figure who could step into that breach. He came into sharp public notice again during the events of Cherson, October 5, 1795. Royalist insurgents threatened to overthrow the Directory, the new executive government of France. By marching on the Tuileries in Paris, Napoleon, tasked with organizing the defense, responded with ruthlessness and efficiency. Deploying artillery in the city streets, he ordered a withering whiff of grapeshot at the advancing crowd, dispersing the insurrection within minutes. The political leadership was impressed by his decisiveness. The public, meanwhile, came to know his name. The episode secured him command of the Army of the Interior and marked him as a reliable enforcer of the revolutionary state, but it also branded him, to some, as unflinching in turning his guns on French citizens if the stability of the regime was at stake. The Directory soon sent him to command the Army of Italy, which had been languishing under poor leadership and losing ground to Austrian and Piedmontese forces. What followed in the Italian campaigns of 1796-1797 would cement Napoleon's reputation as one of history's great battlefield commanders. At the age of 26, he took over an army that was underfed, undersupplied, and demoralized. Within days, he delivered a speech that electrified the troops. He promised them honor, glory, and the riches of victory. His presence, lean and intense, with piercing eyes and an almost ascetic endurance, inspired belief. Napoleon's Italian campaign was a masterclass in maneuver warfare. Against larger and better supplied enemies, he relied on speed, deception, and the ability to fight at decisive points. He split his forces to confuse the Austrians, used rapid, forced marches to strike unexpectedly, and broke alliances between enemy states before they could coalesce against him. At battles like Montenotte, Lodi, Arcola, and Rivoli, his tactics brought improbable victories. The legendary crossing of the bridge at Lodi, where he personally led an assault under intense fire, became a formative moment in his own mind. He later claimed it was there that he first felt himself destined for greatness. These victories transformed northern Italy. Napoleon reorganized the conquered territories into sister republics, spreading revolutionary ideals and replacing feudal laws with more modern codes. He also carried away immense war indemnities and art treasures, funding the French war machine and enriching the Louvre. His use of Italy as both a military and political laboratory foreshadowed the way he would later reshape Europe. But his rise was not without controversy. His independence in command, habit of negotiating directly with foreign powers, and cultivation of personal loyalty among his troops alarmed some in Paris. He was charismatic, but also calculating. His dispatches to the directory often exaggerated victories and minimized setbacks, part of a growing knack for propaganda that kept his reputation sparkling. His marriage to de Beauharnais in 1796, just before leaving for Italy, added a layer of personal intrigue. Was a glamorous widow with important social connections. Their relationship was passionate but notoriously tumultuous, marked by infidelities on both sides. Nonetheless, her presence helped him navigate the Parisian political elite. When he returned from campaign, victory in Italy had made Napoleon a national hero. But by 1798, the Directory sought to channel his ambition away from domestic politics, where his popularity could be a threat, toward a grand strategic venture, an expedition to Egypt. The aim was to disrupt British trade routes to India and establish a French presence in the eastern Mediterranean. Napoleon embraced the plan eagerly, seeing in it both military opportunity and the allure of Eastern conquest that had seduced Alexander the Great centuries before. The Egyptian campaign was remarkable for its blend of warfare, science, and myth-making. Napoleon brought with him not only soldiers, but also a corps of scholars, engineers, and artists, the savants who would study and document the ancient, type, and modern culture of Egypt. This led to the discovery of the Rosetta Stone and a body of research that would lay the foundations of modern Egyptology. Napoleon was crafting his image, not just as a warrior, but as a bringer of civilization and enlightenment, though in truth, his military goals in Egypt would prove far more difficult to achieve. Initially, the campaign went well. He won the Battle of the Pyramids against the Mamluks with disciplined infantry formations impervious to cavalry charges. In his proclamations to the Egyptian people, he presented himself as a friend of Islam and an enemy of their oppressors. But events soon turned against him. The British Royal Navy under Admiral Horatio Nelson destroyed the French fleet at the Battle of the Nile, stranding Napoleon's army in Egypt. Ottoman forces and local uprisings challenged his control, and the promises of liberation rang hollow to many Egyptians under occupation. News from France grew concerning. The Directory was faltering. Military defeats in Europe threatened French gains, and political instability hinted at opportunities for those bold enough to seize them. Ever attuned to shifting tides, Napoleon made a daring choice, leaving much of his army behind under other generals. He slipped back to France in 1799. Some saw it as abandonment, but for Napoleon, it was a calculated gamble. He would return to a nation in need of strong leadership. When his ship reached France, he stepped ashore to find his popularity undimmed. Many French citizens saw him as the victorious general who had brought glory abroad and could rescue the Republic from chaos at home. Within weeks, he became the central figure in a plot to overthrow the Directory. This culminated in the coup of 18 Brumaire, November 1799. Engineered with the help of key allies and his brother, Lucien, the increasingly unpopular directors were pushed aside. And a new government, the Consulate, was formed with Napoleon as first consul, effectively granting him dictatorial powers under the guise of republicanism. In the space of a few short years, the Corsican outsider had climbed from a mock cadet at military school to the most powerful man in France. This transformation was fueled by a combination of military genius, political calculation, personal ambition, and mastery of image. The skills honed in early campaigns, rapid decision-making, reading the psychology of opponents, commanding loyalty, and bending political structures, would define his rule. Yet the challenges ahead were formidable. Europe's monarchies, viewing France's revolution and Napoleon's rise as existential threats, would not rest. At home, administrative chaos, economic strain, and factional politics demanded stability. The next phase of his life would see him transform from revolutionary general into head of state, reshaping France's laws, institutions, and society while waging near-constant war. But in these years of meteoric ascent, we see the crystallization of the values and contradictions that defined him. A belief in merit, yet a taste for personal power. A defender of revolutionary change, yet drawn to the symbols and trappings of monarchy. A military commander willing to risk everything on bold moves, yet meticulous in preparation. A man deeply self-aware of his image in history, already writing and editing his own legend. This was Napoleon at the moment when possibility seemed boundless, when his life was an open canvas on which he would soon paint in sweeping strokes of empire, code, and conquest. And just ahead lay the transformation of France from a restless republic to a new kind of empire, one built around the will and vision of a single man. The coup of 18 Brumaire in November 1799 had been swift, tense, and, at least on the surface, bloodless. It had thrust Napoleon into a position of unparalleled influence in the new political order of the Consulate. Technically, power was shared among 3 consuls, but in reality, Napoleon, as first consul, was the central commanding force. Officially, he served in a republican framework. In practice, he was the state. The France he now governed was exhausted. A decade of revolution had brought sweeping social change, but also instability, terror, and economic strain. Factional politics, rampant corruption, and the endless churn of leaders had sapped public trust. Napoleon understood instinctively that his first task was to restore stability, both to reassure the French people and to strengthen his own hold on power. This meant reordering the machinery of government with the same energy and decisiveness he once applied to the movement of troops on a battlefield. He began by centralizing administration. Prefects were appointed to manage departments, reporting directly to Paris, bypassing local rivalries. He streamlined tax collection, founded the Bank of France to stabilize currency, and encouraged industry and infrastructure projects that could both revive the economy and symbolize national renewal. Roads and bridges were repaired, canals dug, and public works sponsored, practical measures that doubled as propaganda for the effectiveness of the regime. Perhaps his most enduring domestic achievement in this period was the creation of the Napoleonic Code, or Civil Code, of 1804. This ambitious unification of France's patchwork of regional laws embodied some of the revolution's most important principles: equality of all male citizens before the law, protection of private property, and the secular character of state authority. At the same time, it reinforced patriarchal norms, curtailing certain rights for women and prioritizing the family as a unit under male authority. The code was revolutionary in scope, spread across Europe through conquest, and remains influential in many legal systems to this day. Napoleon was equally pragmatic in handling religion. The revolution's anti-clerical excesses had alienated many Catholics, while the radical de-Christianization campaigns had divided communities. In 1801, he negotiated the Concordat with Pope Pius VII, re-establishing the Catholic Church in France, but under a framework that left it subordinate to the state. Clergy would receive state salaries and swear loyalty to the government. The Concordat soothed religious tensions without restoring the Church's former power, a political masterstroke. On the military front, Napoleon moved quickly to end the Second Coalition War that had plagued France since 1798. His victory at the Battle of Marengo in June 1800 against Austrian forces in Italy was decisive not only strategically but symbolically, cementing his legitimacy at home. With the Treaty of 1801 and the Treaty of Amiens with Britain, in 1802, France enjoyed a brief period of peace, the first since the Revolution began. For a moment, it seemed Napoleon's vision of a stable, prosperous France was within reach. Peace also allowed him to focus on building a state bureaucracy based on merit. Skilled administrators and officers could rise regardless of noble birth, an approach that rewarded competence and loyalty. Many families who had once despised the revolution found a path back into public life, if they served the new regime well. Yet this meritocracy was not purely idealistic. It was a tool for consolidating control, binding the ambitions of France's elite to Napoleon's fortunes. In 1802, constitutional referendum made him first consul for life. The transition from revolutionary general to a leader with near-monarchical powers was nearly complete. Though Napoleon insisted he was still the servant of a republic, he cultivated his image with care. Portraits showed him in the sober dress of a revolutionary statesman, hand tucked into his waistcoat in a pose that suggested calm authority. Public ceremonies, civic speeches, and the strategic use of newspapers all contributed to the mythology of a leader who brought order out of chaos. It was during this time that Napoleon deepened his fascination with the idea of legacy. He commissioned monumental architecture, the Arc de Triomphe, the transformation of the Louvre, and urban projects in Paris and other cities that would project the grandeur of his era into the future. He reformed education, creating a network to train the next generation of administrators, officers, and loyal citizens. Yet cracks remained beneath the surface. France's colonial ambitions brought moral and strategic dilemmas. In the Caribbean, Napoleon sought to restore French control over territories lost during the Revolution, including Saint-Domingue, Haiti. The Haitian Revolution, led by Toussaint Louverture, had already abolished slavery and created a powerful black-led state. Napoleon sent a massive expedition in 1802 to reassert authority and restore slavery. But disease, fierce resistance, and the leadership of Jean-Jacques Dessalines doomed the mission. Haiti declared independence in 1804, becoming the first free republic led by formerly enslaved people. The failure was a blow to French prestige and marked the beginning of Napoleon's shift in focus from overseas colonies to dominance in Europe. The brief peace with Britain also proved fragile. By 1803, tensions over colonial ambitions, maritime trade, and European influence led to renewed war. Napoleon responded with plans to invade Britain, amassing forces along the Channel coast. Although the invasion never materialized, the preparations demonstrated his capacity for organizing vast military resources and keeping opponents guessing. In 1804, a foiled royalist assassination plot against him became the pretext for a dramatic change. Napoleon used the threat as justification to crown himself Emperor of the French. In a ceremony at Notre Dame Cathedral in December, attended by Pope Pius VII in a carefully negotiated appearance, Napoleon took the crown from the altar and placed it on his own head, a gesture that proclaimed he owed his authority to no one, not even the Church. Josephine was crowned empress at his side. With this act, the Republic had transformed into an empire, and Napoleon's personal rule was no longer cloaked in the language of shared government. The coronation was more than vanity. It was a calculation of power. As Emperor Napoleon could bind his reforms into a durable structure, command loyalty in more traditional monarchical terms, and negotiate with other sovereigns as an equal. But it also placed him squarely in the company of the very rulers France's revolution had sought to overthrow. For many Europeans, the irony was sharp. The revolutionary general, who had risen on promises of liberty, now held imperial power reminiscent of the old regime. Yet Napoleon viewed this as the culmination of the revolution's true aim, replacing the chaos of hereditary privilege with a merit-based elite under a strong central authority. His empire would be the vessel in which the revolution's legal and social reforms could be preserved and spread. Still in his mid-30s, he now held in his hands both the destiny of France and the seeds of a vast European ambition. The armies he would lead in the coming years were not just seeking victory, they were carriers of the Napoleonic system, an export of law, administration, and ideology backed by the thunder of cannon. The next chapter of his life would be written on the battlefields of Central Europe, where he would face coalitions of monarchies determined to contain him, and where his genius and his vulnerabilities would be sharply defined. With the crown now resting by his own hand upon his head, Napoleon Bonaparte was no longer the first consul of a revolutionary republic. He was emperor of the French, and the transformation was more than ceremonial. In his mind, France was now equipped with a stable core of laws, institutions, and centralized authority forged in the fires of the revolution and refined under his hand. What remained was to secure France's dominance on the continent and protect the empire from the coalitions forming to contain him. His coronation in December 1804 had already provoked unease among the monarchies of Europe. Britain, Austria, Russia, and others feared that the same man who had clawed his way to supreme power from the ranks of the Revolutionary Army might use his armies to spread upheaval beyond France's borders. Those fears were entirely justified. Napoleon had no intention of letting France be hemmed in. The Grande, as he proudly renamed his elite forces, was about to become the most formidable fighting force Europe had ever seen. At first, the primary threat lay across the English Channel. Britain's naval supremacy insulted him, and the resumption of war in 1803 had reignited the idea of invasion. At Boulogne, he assembled a vast camp of soldiers, drilled relentlessly, and prepared flat-bottomed boats to carry them across. But the Royal Navy, under admirals like Nelson, ruled the water. Napoleon's plan relied on luring the British fleet away long enough for a crossing, but events would steer him elsewhere. In 1805, the Third Coalition formed an alliance of Britain, Austria, Russia, and others, aiming to crush France's burgeoning empire. Abandoning the invasion of Britain, Napoleon pivoted with the speed of a fencer changing stance. His army pivoted east in a series of dazzling marches toward Central Europe, covering distances that baffled his enemies. These maneuvers culminated in December 1805 in what would be remembered as perhaps his greatest tactical masterpiece, the Battle of Austerlitz. At Austerlitz, facing the combined Russian and Austrian armies, Napoleon deliberately appeared weaker than he was, enticing his opponents to attack what they thought was his right flank. In reality, this weakness was bait. Once the enemy pressed in, he struck decisively at their center, splitting the Allied forces and shattering their cohesion. The son of Austerlitz became a phrase forever linked to his genius. The image of an emperor who could read a battlefield as an artist reads a canvas and paint it with victory. The triumph led to the Treaty of Pressburg, forcing Austria out of the war and redrawing the map of Europe in France's favor. The next year, in 1806, Napoleon turned his attention to Prussia, whose leaders had been stung by his growing dominance. The two great battles of Jena and Auerstedt were fought on the same day, and together they annihilated the Prussian army. Saxony came under his sway, and much of northern Germany was reorganized into the Confederation of the Rhine, a bloc of client states under French influence. Napoleon was not just fighting wars, he was constructing an imperial architecture, replacing ancient feudalisms with administrations modeled after his own centralized codified system. But war was an unending cycle. In 1807, at Eylau in Friedland in Poland, Napoleon's forces faced brutal conditions against the Russians. The fighting was ferocious, the winter brutal, and for the first time, his aura of invincibility was tested. Yet at Friedland, he secured a decisive win. Leading to the treaties of Tilsit with Tsar Alexander I, Europe was momentarily recarved. Much of Central and Western Europe under direct or indirect French control. Prussia shrunken, Russia technically allied. It was the zenith of Napoleon's continental rise. At Tilsit, he and Alexander met famously on a raft in the Niemen River, each measuring the other. For a time, they divided influence like the emperors of old. Napoleon in charge of Western and Central Europe, Alexander dominating the East. Britain stood alone in open defiance, shielded by its navy. To counter British trade and finance, Napoleon launched the Continental System, an economic blockade prohibiting European states under his control from trading with Britain. This war by embargo aimed to strangle Britain's economy, but proved devilishly hard to enforce. As smuggling thrived and neutral nations bristled under the restrictions. At home, Napoleon's regime was tightening its grip. Titles of nobility were reintroduced, not as feudal privileges, but as honors tied to service and merit in the empire. Marshals of France were granted lands, and loyal administrators were rewarded. His reforms in the satellite kingdoms, placing brothers and allies on thrones in Spain, Naples, Holland, Westphalia, spread both his control and his code. In Milan, Warsaw, Naples, and beyond, Napoleonic legal principles took root. Yet the further his reach extended, the more resistance it stirred. Nationalism, ironically, was swelling in reaction to French dominance in Spain, in Germany, in Italy. In the Iberian Peninsula, trouble began brewing in 1807–1808, when Napoleon attempted to tighten control over Portugal and Spain to enforce the continental system. His decision to replace the Spanish Bourbon monarchy with his brother Joseph Bonaparte ignited a firestorm of insurgency. Spanish guerrilla warfare, brutal and relentless, tied down tens of thousands of French troops and bled the empire's resources. Britain, under Wellington, landed forces to aid the resistance. What Napoleon had thought would be a quick stabilization turned into a grinding, morale-sapping drain, an ulcer, as he would call it. Meanwhile, Napoleon's personal life shifted. His marriage, too, childless after years together, weighed on his mind and on the question of dynastic succession. Deeply fond of her, yet convinced of the need for an heir, he divorced her in 1810 and married Archduchess Marie-Louise of Austria, securing both an alliance with a former enemy and the promise of legitimacy in the eyes of Europe's royal houses. In 1811, she bore him a son, Napoleon II, titled King of Rome, cementing his line, at least in appearance. By this period, the empire was near its largest extent. From the Atlantic to the frontiers of Russia, from the Baltic to southern Italy, either Napoleon himself or his family ruled. In public ceremonies, legal reforms, and military parades, he projected the image of a modern Charlemagne, blending revolutionary meritocracy with imperial grandeur. Yet the very scale of this dominion ceded its fragility. Restive populations, the economic strain of near-constant war, Britain's unbroken naval presence, and the complexities of alliance with Russia all formed cracks beneath the surface. One of the least known but revealing aspects of his rule during this apex period was his obsession with detail. Napoleon dictated policy down to the minutiae, the height of soldiers' plumes, the curriculum in provincial schools, the exact phrasing of laws. He would work late into the night over paperwork and correspondence, micromanaging at a scale few rulers have attempted. This obsessive control sometimes achieved astonishing coherence. Other times, it slowed adaptability as subordinates learned to await decisions from the emperor himself. In these same years, his reputation abroad was deeply polarized. To some, he was the liberator who had smashed feudal privileges and brought legal equality. To others, the foreign tyrant who trampled national independence. The intellectual classes of Europe wrestled with his contradictions. even as ordinary farmers and workers often experienced his rule through the language of taxation, conscription, and war. By 1812, the uneasy partnership with Russia was deteriorating. Tsar Alexander chafed under the continental system, which harmed Russia's economy, and resented Napoleon's expanding influence in Poland through the Duchy of Warsaw. Napoleon, reading defiance in Alexander's moves, prepared for his most ambitious and ultimately disastrous campaign, the invasion of Russia. But at the close of these glory years, from Austerlitz to the Tilsit Accords, from the creation of the Napoleonic Codes, Europeans spread to the zenith of territorial control. Napoleon stood as master of continental Europe. His rise from the windswept island of Corsica to this pinnacle was without precedent, propelled by sheer will, strategic brilliance, and an unyielding belief in his own destiny. Yet the same drive that had built his empire was now steering him onto the vast plains of Russia, where the elements, the distances, and the limits of even his genius would be laid bare. By 1812, Napoleon stood at the apex of his power. But the alliances and dominions he had built were stretched thin, brittle under the weight of constant war and ever-expanding demands. At the heart of the new tension was the fragile accord with Russia, struck at Tilsit 5 years earlier. What had once been hailed as a fraternal pact between emperors had decayed into mutual suspicion. Tsar Alexander I resented the constraints of the continental system, which strangled much of Russia's overseas trade, and bristled at what he saw as Napoleon's creeping domination of Central Europe. Particularly through the Duchy of Warsaw, Napoleon, for his part, interpreted Russia's growing restiveness and its relaxed enforcement of the blockade as a direct challenge to his authority, and perhaps as an invitation to settle matters by force. Negotiations sputtered and stalled, each side probing for advantage but unwilling to back down. By the spring of 1812, Napoleon made a decision that would prove the most consequential of his reign. He would invade Russia, compel Alexander back into strict alliance, and demonstrate once again that defiance of France carried unbearable costs. The campaign would also, he believed, secure his empire's eastern flank and reassert the credibility of the continental system. The preparations were on a scale Europe had never seen. The Grand assembled for the invasion numbered perhaps 600,000 men, a staggering polyglot force of French veterans and conscripts alongside Poles, Italians, Germans, Dutch, Spaniards, Croats, and others from across his satellite states and allies. The logistical challenge was immense, feeding, arming, and coordinating this host across hundreds of miles into the Russian interior. Yet Napoleon approached it with his customary energy and faith in the momentum of his operations. In June 1812, the army crossed the Niemen River into Russian territory. At first, Napoleon anticipated a swift series of decisive battles, believing that the Russians would defend forward and be crushed. Instead, the Russian commanders, Barclay de Tolly and later Prince Bagration, adopted a scorched earth strategy, retreating deeper into their vast country while destroying supplies and shelter as they went. The French took territory, but at the cost of exhausting their own lines of supply, a creeping corrosion that Napoleon's operational brilliance could not fully prevent. The summer heat, dust, and long marches thinned the army's strength. Disease, desertion, and hunger claimed tens of thousands before any major battle was fought. When at last the Russians resolved to stand and fight, it was near the village of Borodino in September. The Battle of Borodino was one of the bloodiest single days of the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon threw his forces again and again at well-prepared Russian positions. Victory came, if it can be called that, at a terrible price. Perhaps 70,000 casualties between the two sides and no decisive destruction of the Russian army. From Borodino, Napoleon pressed on to Moscow, expecting that seizing the ancient capital would force Alexander to negotiate. In mid-September, he entered the city, only to find it largely abandoned and, soon after, consumed by fire. Whether set deliberately by Russian patriots or by accident, the Great Fire destroyed much of Moscow's usable shelter and supplies, leaving the Grande in a hollow triumph. Weeks passed with no peace offer from the Tsar, who had retreated to the east and vowed not to bargain while a single foreign soldier remained on Russian soil. As the brutal Russian winter closed in, Napoleon made the fateful decision to retreat in October. It was a march that turned into a nightmare. The same roads they had advanced along were now stripped bare, littered with the corpses of men and horses. Starvation, freezing temperatures, and relentless harassment by Cossacks and partisan fighters decimated the army. Discipline crumbled. Soldiers collapsed in snowdrifts, too weak to rise. Frostbite and typhus stalked the remnants. The crossing of the Berezina River in late November became emblematic of the disaster. Pursued by superior Russian forces, the desperate French built makeshift bridges under fire to cross the icy waters. Thousands perished in the chaos. When the Grande finally staggered back into friendly territory, perhaps 100,000 of the original 600,000 remained fit for service. The aura of invincibility that had shielded Napoleon since Italy was shattered as news of the catastrophe spread across Europe. Seizing the moment, his enemies rallied. The Sixth Coalition, Britain, Russia, Prussia, Sweden, and eventually Austria, formed in 1813 to drive the weakened emperor back. Napoleon, demonstrating that his tactical genius had not deserted him, rushed to rebuild his forces. Astonishingly, he fielded new armies and in the spring campaign of 1813 won battles such as Lausanne and Bautzen, but the quality of his troops was diminished. Many were young conscripts lacking the veterans' hardened cohesion. The armistice that summer offered Napoleon a chance to negotiate, but his unwillingness to accept significant territorial concessions doomed the talks. When hostilities resumed, the coalition deployed a new strategy, the Trachtenberg Plan, designed to avoid direct battle with Napoleon himself, where he often triumphed, and instead focus on defeating his marshals, isolating his forces, and wearing down his army. By the autumn of 1813, the decisive confrontation came at Leipzig, the Battle of Nations. Over 4 days in October, the largest battle of the Napoleonic Wars unfolded. Vast armies clashed across rivers and villages, with the coalition gradually enveloping the French. Even as Napoleon fought with skill, numbers, and coordination told against him. A critical bridge was blown too soon during the retreat, cutting off part of his force and turning withdrawal into rout. Defeated, Napoleon fell back to ward France, his dominance in Germany extinguished. In early 1814, the coalition crossed into France itself. Napoleon conducted a brilliant defensive campaign, winning several small battles against superior numbers. Montereau, Camp Albert, Montmiel, feats that reminded the world why he had risen so high. But the tide could not be turned. Paris was captured in March. His marshals, exhausted and seeing no alternative, urged him to abdicate. In April 1814, Napoleon renounced the throne. The Allies exiled him to the tiny Mediterranean island of Elba, granting him sovereignty over the island, a small personal guard, and the title of emperor in name only. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, Europe prepared to move on from the era of Napoleonic dominance. Yet Napoleon was not a man to fade quietly into exile. From Elba, he followed news from France closely. The restored Bourbon monarchy, under Louis XVIII, stumbled in regaining popular support. Discontent simmered among soldiers and citizens who remembered the glory days. In February 1815, Napoleon seized his chance. Escaping Elba with a small band, he landed on the French coast and began marching north toward Paris. In one of history's most dramatic episodes, troops sent to arrest him instead joined him. Legend says that when confronted by royal forces, he stepped forward, opened his coat, and declared, "If any of you will shoot your emperor, here I am." Not a shot was fired. His march became a rolling wave of support. The 100 days had begun. Back in Paris, Napoleon moved swiftly to consolidate his position and offered a constitution promising reforms. But the great powers of Europe, meeting at the Congress of Vienna, declared him an outlaw and prepared for war once more. The coalition armies, particularly those of Britain under Wellington and the Prussians under Blucher, mobilized to meet him. The final act came in June 1815 at Waterloo in present-day Belgium. Napoleon sought to divide and defeat the Anglo-Allied and Prussian armies before they could unite. Early engagements at Ligny and Quatre Bras delayed and disrupted his enemies, but at Waterloo itself, relentless Anglo-Allied resistance, late-arriving Prussian reinforcements, and tactical misjudgments thwarted his last gamble. By evening, his army was collapsing in retreat. Napoleon abdicated a second time, hoping to sail to America, but British forces intercepted him. This time, there was to be no comfortable Mediterranean exile. The Allies sent him to the remote South Atlantic island of St. Helena, a windswept volcanic outpost under British control from which escape was impossible. On St. Helena, Napoleon lived under constant supervision in a damp, drafty house called Longwood. He dictated memoirs to loyal companions, shaping the story of his life with an unmistakable eye toward posterity. He cast himself as a revolutionary hero betrayed by monarchs, a lawgiver whose reforms outlasted him, a man who had tried to remake Europe in the image of merit and modernity. Ill health dogged him, possibly stomach cancer, though some suspected poisoning. In May 1821, at the age of 51, Napoleon died. His last words reportedly were, "France, T.T.D." He was buried on the island, though his remains were returned to France in 1840 and interred in a magnificent tomb at Les Invalides in Paris, sealing his posthumous return as a national icon. His legacy is one of awe and ambivalence, a man who rose from obscurity to command empires, who spread principles of law and governance while waging wars of staggering scale, who inspired both devotion and resistance. From the heights of Austerlitz to the snows of Russia, from emperor's coronation to exile in the middle of the ocean, Napoleon Bonaparte's life story remains one of history's most compelling epics, a testament to the power of vision, will, and the human capacity to shape and be shaped by the tides of history. Life on St. Helena could not have been a starker contrast to the grand courts of Europe Napoleon had once commanded. The island was a lonely speck in the South Atlantic, more than 1,000 miles from the nearest continent, its volcanic cliffs rising abruptly from the sea. The British had chosen it precisely for its remoteness and inaccessibility. There would be no Elba-style return from here. Guard ships patrolled the waters, and the governor, Sir Hudson Lowe, enforced strict regulations on his movements, correspondence, and visitors. Napoleon arrived there in October 1815 with a small retinue of loyal followers, generals like Bertrand, Unthalin, and Gourgaud, his faithful valet, Marchung, and a handful of servants. The party took up residence in Longwood House, a building that was damp, drafty, and ill-suited to the island's climate. Over time, its uncomfortable conditions, combined with the isolation, would take a toll on his health. Denied the power that had defined his adult life, Napoleon adapted by turning inward and toward posterity. He began dictating memoirs, reflections, and justifications to his companions, consciously crafting the narrative by which he wished to be remembered. The De Saint Helene, compiled by Emmanuel Delas Cases, presented him as a political visionary and soldier-statesman who had spread the values of the French Revolution across Europe only to be crushed by reactionary monarchies. It was part truth, part self-mythologizing, but powerfully effective. In the salons and studies of 19th-century Europe, this romanticized Napoleon caught the imagination of liberals, reformers, and nationalists alike. Life on the island settled into a repetitive rhythm. Napoleon would rise late, take walks in the garden, or ride when the weather permitted, spend long afternoons in conversation or dictating recollections, and dine with his entourage in the evenings. Even here, his attention to detail persisted. He corrected drafts, debated interpretations of his campaigns, and quizzed his companions on historical parallels, always framing his life within the continuum of great leaders from Caesar to Charlemagne. relations with Hudson Lowe were frosty at best. Napoleon blamed the governor for petty harassments, censoring correspondence, and failing to improve Longwood's conditions. Lowe, for his part, suspected every request concealed an escape plot. Their mutual distrust became one of the enduring features of Napoleon's exile. But there were also quieter, more personal moments. Napoleon enjoyed tending to the garden, sometimes reading aloud to his companions from Corneille, Ossian, or Plutarch. He reminisced about his youth in Corsica and spoke tenderly of his son, the King of Rome, whom he would never see again. Accounts from those around him reveal flashes of humor, melancholy, and philosophical reflection. A man both resigned and still fiercely proud. Physically, his health began to decline from around 1817. He complained of abdominal pains, nausea, and fatigue. Some attributed this to the damp, unhealthy environment. Others speculated about poisoning, a theory fueled in later years by chemical analysis of his hair showing elevated arsenic levels, though whether from deliberate murder, environmental exposure, or 19th century medicines remains debated. Napoleon himself seemed to suspect cancer, which had afflicted his father. In these last years, he often revisited the pivotal choices of his reign. He defended the Russian campaign as a strategic necessity gone awry through unforeseen circumstances. He lamented his decision to divorce, though he acknowledged the dynastic logic. He insisted that his wars had been defensive responses to coalitions bent on destroying revolutionary France. Inwardly, he may have also wrestled with the contradictions between the ideals he professed and the autocratic methods he had often employed. On the 5th of May, 1821, after days of drifting in and out of consciousness, Napoleon died, aged 51. His final words, France, TD, linked his country, his soldiers, his role as their leader, and the woman who had been his first great love. He was buried on the island, in a secluded valley he had admired under a simple stone. 2 decades later, in 1840, his remains were returned to France in a state funeral, watched by vast crowds, and entombed beneath the Great Dome of Les Invalides in Paris. Even before that dramatic reinterment, the Napoleonic legend was in full bloom. Painters, poets, and political movements claimed him for their own, as a martyr to liberty, a symbol of national pride, or a cautionary tale about overreaching ambition. Across Europe and beyond, reformers drew on the image of the man of merit, who had risen to the summit of power. Critics warned of the dangers of the charismatic autocrat. The duality was part of his enduring grip on the imagination. Beyond the grand battles and diplomatic treaties, the exile on St. Helena added a final, almost theatrical act to the Napoleonic drama. The fallen emperor on a lonely rock, defying his captors with memory and words, turning his own life into a parable for history. It ensured that when people spoke of him thereafter, they would speak not only of conquest and empire, but of resilience in defeat and the potency of an idea that could survive the man who embodied it. Strip away the imperial robes, the plumed hat, the thunder of cannon, and the formal portraits, and you find a human being full of quirks, contradictions, and a surprising range of interests. Part of Napoleon's enduring fascination lies in the fact that for all his monumental impact on history, he was also intensely human. A man who could be petty and playful, vain and self-effacing, superstitious and shrewd all at once. One such oft-repeated but misunderstood fact is his height. Opponents in Britain caricatured him as a tiny man, a little corporal, to diminish his stature. In reality, contemporary measurements put him around 5 feet 6 or 5 feet 7 inches by modern standards, about average for a Frenchman of his era. The myth of his shortness endures because it serves preconceived narratives, the small man compensating through grand ambition. Napoleon, aware of British propaganda, sometimes played into it ironically, knowing how powerful image-making could be. He was, by most accounts, a workaholic who thrived on little sleep, often functioning on 4 or 5 hours a night. This relentlessness allowed him to oversee the minutiae of governance and the sweeping strategies of war simultaneously. Yet he also had a knack for brief, intense naps almost anywhere on a battlefield, in a carriage. Between dictating documents, waking refreshed and ready to make rapid decisions. His staff learned to adapt to a rhythm defined entirely by his needs. Contrary to the image of the purely martial mind, Napoleon had a deep appreciation for literature, theater, and science. He read Plutarch's Lives as a boy, admiring the moral and tactical lessons of antiquity. In adulthood, he surrounded himself with books. On campaigns, he traveled with a mobile library containing hundreds of volumes, ranging from classical history to the latest political philosophy. During the Egyptian expedition between battles and administration, he convened discussions on archaeology, commissioned scientific surveys, and took a keen interest in the work of the savants documenting the pyramids and the Nile. His handwriting was famously fast, almost indecipherable, a mixture of French and occasional Italian phrasing, littered with abbreviations. Dictation was his preferred mode of working. He would pace and speak in a torrent while secretaries scribbled to keep up, cutting through topics from military orders to the design of a new road in the same breath. Napoleon's personal tastes were simple in some ways, refined in others. He could be indifferent to lavish banquets, sometimes eating quickly and without ceremony, content with roast chicken, bread, and a glass of wine. Yet he had a fondness for certain luxuries: fine hats, well-tailored uniforms, and the cologne of Jean-Marie Farina, which he used liberally. He was fastidious about his appearance in uniform. Understanding the importance of presentation to a leader's authority and morale. Though capable of icy discipline, he could also be unexpectedly informal. Soldiers remembered him addressing them directly, recalling past battles, joking about shared hardships, or delivering sharply personal praise. He relished these connections. They were a core part of his ability to inspire loyalty. The legend of Napoleon walking among his troops, recalling individual acts of bravery years later, is supported by multiple memoirs. His relationships, especially romantic ones, reveal yet another side. His intense attachment, too, was fueled by passion, a sense of mutual glamour, and perhaps an element of dependency in his early career. Her infidelities wounded him deeply, yet he too strayed, and political necessity eventually overrode personal feeling in their divorce. With Marie-Louise, there appears to have been genuine affection alongside the political alliance. Though she was young and, unlike, less central to his mythos, there were superstitions too. Napoleon placed stock in omens, dreams, and lucky charms. He carried a portrait of his wife into battle and kept tokens from his family. He spoke once of a star that guided his destiny, an idea that blended Enlightenment rationalism with the fatalism of a Corsican steeped in oral tradition. He could be charming in intimate conversation, but also cuttingly sarcastic or domineering. Subordinates both feared and admired his memory for detail. He could recall the exact position of a battery in a past battle, or a logistical figure from a distant report, and expect others to match his recall. Those who failed to meet his standard were often subjected to sharp public corrections. Some more curious anecdotes have a way of enduring because they show how unexpected moments can pierce the armor of power. During the retreat from Russia, amid the frozen catastrophe, he is said to have paused to warm a shivering child by the roadside before moving on. A fleeting act of compassion in a sea of suffering. In exile on Elba, he personally oversaw public works projects, inspected farms, and listened to complaints from fishermen, as if still the ruler of a larger domain. On St. Helena, he amused himself by teaching English phrases, playing cards, and even dictating imaginary constitutions for hypothetical countries. There were also moments when his calculated control of image merged seamlessly with self-reflection. He knew his memoirs would be read as history. He chose which failures to concede, which to explain away, and which to lay at the feet of others. By shaping his own story, he ensured that the Napoleon people remembered would always be, to some extent, the one he had designed. These lesser-known traits and incidents do not diminish his legend, they deepen it. They remind us that the man who could move armies like pieces on a vast chessboard also fretted over love, believed in luck, valued a favorite scent, and could lose himself in a book. They make him human, and paradoxically, that humanity is part of what elevates him to the status of a legend. The emperor in the grand coronation robes and the Corsican boy reading by lamplight are two sides of the same coin. Napoleon Bonaparte's story does not end in a tomb or fade quietly into the pages of dusty history. Instead, it reverberates, sometimes as myth, sometimes as warning, sometimes as inspiration, wherever ambition, reinvention, and vision collide with reality. In reflecting on his full life, we see how each phase both contained its own universe of experiences and resonated far beyond its immediate moment. The boy from Corsica, caught between identities, switching languages. Forced to prove himself among the French aristocracy, became the template for outsiders everywhere who carried the spark of relentless drive and the pain of exclusion. His youth offered not just lessons in resilience, but in the value of scrutiny, the willingness to question not only the world but oneself, and to turn the harsh judgment of others into fuel for greatness. Rising on the tides of the revolution, Napoleon became proof that talent, discipline, and strategic thinking could break old orders and create new ones. His artillery at Toulon, his daring crossings and bold flanking maneuvers in Italy, the impossible campaigns waged and won against odds. Each are celebrated for military genius, but also for the willingness to innovate, to risk, and to adapt as circumstances changed. His ability to turn setbacks into opportunities, to pivot an invasion plan into a continental war, to redirect political defeat into the foundation of an empire, speaks to a mind perpetually in motion, never content to settle for the expected. As consul and then emperor, Napoleon embodied a paradox unique in history. He implemented codes and reforms that would outlast his reign, building an administrative and legal framework that gave access to education, careers, and justice for millions. Yet he ruled often as a pragmatic autocrat, silencing dissent when it threatened the stability he worked so feverishly to build. The Napoleonic Code still structures civil law in dozens of countries, just as his reforms in taxation, education, and administration remain the foundation stones of the modern state. The legend of Napoleon was also a creation of his own hand, the self-made emperor who mastered propaganda, who understood how symbols, coronations, monuments, portraits, public ceremonies, shape not just the present moment, but memory itself. He did not invent the concept of the charismatic ruler, but he weaponized it for an age of newspapers, art, and myth. In this, he was both modernizer and magician, sculpting the world's perception of himself with every act. In war, his determination was unmatched, yet so too were the tragic dimensions of his ambition. The campaigns across Europe brought liberation for some, but devastation for others. The reach for dominance produced not only glory, but grinding hardship for millions. The lessons of Austerlitz, Jena, and Wagram, the disasters of Russia and Waterloo, these remain cautionary tales on the limits of power. The dangers of overreach and the price paid when genius collides with the unpredictable currents of nature and humanity. Exile on Elba and St. Helena did not extinguish the spirit that had animated his journey. If anything, the final chapters revealed the power of reinvention. The man who could step ashore in France after defeat and, by force of presence and legend alone, rally an army for one last stand, reminds us that histories can turn on the afterlife of ideas as much as physical victories. On St. Helena, stripped of armies and palaces, Napoleon turned inward and set out to shape his legacy, dictating memoirs and conversations designed to endure long after the body was gone. In this, he joined the company of the most enduring historical figures, those whose afterimage recasts the events of their time and reframes the questions asked by posterity. Yet beneath the thunder of legend, the smaller stories remain. The man obsessed by detail, calibrating strategy late into the night. The emperor who joked with soldiers and wept over lost friends. the reader of Plutarch, the lover who longed for even as he embraced new alliances. These humanizing details, his quirks, sense of humor, moments of compassion, bridge the gap between myth and reality. The contradictions persist. The lawgiver who was also a conqueror, the liberal who became emperor, the romantic who divorced for the sake of an heir, the winner who ultimately lost. Even in death, his story became a stage for competing narratives. Some saw him as the martyr of progress, others as an avatar of hubris and empire. His body lay first on a windswept Atlantic rock, later journeying in state to the heart of Paris, watched by crowds who saw themselves reflected both in his triumph and his tragedy. After 200 years, the curiosity remains strong. Why did he risk the Russian winter? Did he truly believe in his destiny, or mold it for the world's eyes? Was he a force for liberation or domination? Did he love the idea of France more than the reality of her people? What private doubts did he keep? What regrets did he name only to himself? The debates go on, as do the rediscoveries in archives, libraries, and battlefield relics. His enduring inspiration lies not in the easy victories, but in the complexity of his pursuit. He reminds us that greatness is a shifting landscape, that ambition can uplift and imperil. That change comes not through perfection, but through ceaseless effort, and sometimes through failure, reborn as legend. There are moments, at the end of all drama, when the echo of one life grows larger than the man himself. Napoleon is one such echo, present in law, in the art of leadership, in the lessons of risk and adaptation, and in the very questions we ask about purpose, destiny, and the shape of history itself. In that sense, the walk begun in Corsica is never finished. Anyone who dreams beyond boundaries, who dares to invent or defy, who wrestles with the price of power and the call of conscience, walks, in some small way, alongside the arc of Napoleon Bonaparte. And so, his legend endures, unfinished, refracted through time. A reminder that the journey from outsider to leader, from reformer to ruler, from vision to reality, is always filled with tension, inspiration, and, most of all, the capacity to change not just the world, but ourselves.